go, starting the recording. All right. One of the essay questions that are listed on the essay file in Blackboard asks you to describe the 3 main causes of a decline in biodiversity. And this first slide is where you can come to find those 3 things. And then I've got a few examples for you. So you can build the essay question kind of from this organization. So we'll talk about habitat destruction, non-native species, so that just means introduced species is another way to think about it, and then over exploitation of wildlife. And as we're going through, if you have any North Carolina examples, that would be great. I'm still learning about all of those. And the first one that comes to mind is habitat destruction. I don't know about where you're at, Brittany, but near us, there's just so much construction going on all the time. And that leads to a lot of the forests being cleared, and that's habitat for animals, and they've got to find somewhere to live. And some species are very territorial, and so that means if they don't have their certain space, then it's just like we're kicking them out of their house. And we see species number declines, and then also a lot of shifts in where certain species were or weren't found, and that really changing. You can see this particular picture in Brazil. That's the exact same area from 1985 to 2000. And for reference, this right here is this part right here. So what once was very thick forest now really is a growing city. 2 species in particular that have become endangered because of this are all different types of turtles. And in living in Florida previous to North Carolina, a lot of the turtle conservation efforts were very much local. They had local researchers go out during breeding season and make sure that things like excess lights weren't on. So if you can imagine all of the tourists that come down and all of the hotels that sit on the beach, that becomes an issue because the turtle babies actually use the moon as a navigation system to kind of get back out to the ocean. So that's a huge effort to make sure that turtles are able to continue to reproduce. And then another example further north is the Canadian lynx. Brittany, do you know of any animals locally that are endangered or would fall under this category?
A Carolina, I forgot the name of the bird. I mean, not squirrel, it's a Carolina flying squirrel. Yeah, that's what it is called. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They're actually declining because of the construction. Like, they live in like high forests and mountains, and a lot of people are like tearing down the forests for like purposes like making cities and homes for people. So they're like now having to find like new homes like in the mountains and stuff. So it's very limited. I actually did research on it the other day for a project.
Awesome. That's a great example, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. Nice. There we go. So we've been talking about kind of this development and homes. That seems to be the big development that's been happening in North Carolina, but it also can be due to agriculture, mining, different waterway constructions with damming. And damming in the water flow is super interesting. I had a friend tell me that they removed a dam that beavers created kind of in their backyard property area, and they actually had coyotes that came in closer to their home because the dam was removed. So a lot of these habitat changes have this trickle-down effect. What we think impacts one species then impacts another. And what really becomes an issue is this habitat fragmentation. So that means that species that have a large range of where they roam in between, if we're cutting off the flow between one area and another, then that definitely decreases their habitat space, their square footage. Yeah. Pollution is also a big issue. So this is a picture of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig that exploded. There's a movie that was made about it, but even as recent as the past few years, they were still paying local fishermen that were impacted by this oil rig. So it wasn't just wildlife and marine life right around where that oil rig exploded, but it was, thousands of square miles that were impacted. So pollution can be a huge issue. I encourage you, when you're going through this PowerPoint, to click on this ocean cleanup and to watch the video associated with it. What the video talks about is technology that's being developed to take care of these garbage patches. And they are just so much larger than we can ever imagine. Because of the currents, any of the trash that is in the ocean ends up in these huge garbage patches. And we're not talking about like a small pond worth of trash. We're talking about miles of square footage where this trash is just absolutely thick like this. So the technology is trying to like sweep up all of that trash into these nets and then removing it.
That's a lot of trash.
Oh my gosh. The video, I think, does a good job of giving you a visual of how much trash that actually is. It's just one of those things that finding a frame of reference without seeing it is just not possible. We know that we've seen a lot of different adjustments to the climate over the years, and that definitely impacts the species that are able to live in that area. So for example, as the ocean temperatures increase, which we think is kind of a good thing because we can use the ocean more often, but it actually causes the coral to be killed. So when they talk about coral bleaching, like we see here with the white coral, that actually means that the algae has been killed inside the coral. So that's definitely not a good thing. We also know that biodiversity can be decreased by invasive species. And invasive species are such a problem because there's no natural predators. In Guam in particular, they introduced this tree snake. And I can't remember what pest they were trying to control, but what they didn't anticipate is that the brown tree snakes were such good hunters that they just absolutely decimated all of the birds. So invasive species can definitely be an issue. Up near Michigan, in the Great Lakes, these zebra mussels actually attach themselves to boats, and that's how they got brought in kind of from the New England area into the Great Lakes. And then down in the Caribbean and in Florida, they have the lionfish, which is poisonous. And they've actually found that the lionfish can survive in much different salinity of water than they initially thought. And so we see it creeping further and further north. Also in Florida, more so down in the Everglades near Miami, pythons are a huge issue. They just don't have any natural predators, and they really like to eat things like marsh rabbits. They actually have a python hunting competition each year where people are paid to go hunt these pythons, and I'm sure there's a prize for the biggest or heaviest or longest. And then I'm not sure if there's zoo in North Carolina, but I do remember seeing it in South Carolina. And this is a climbing vine that really just takes over all of the plants. Brittany, can you think of any invasive species that you see in North Carolina?
I think of one off the top of my head. I want to say where I live, I would say foxes. For
Okay.
they really take over here in the country where I live, as far as getting small birds and stuff and small animals.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure I want to do a lot more research about that because it's really interesting how one species could really take over a whole, another species. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I'll have to do some more research too. They also kind of introduce certain species on purpose in order to try to control other species. One was the stingless wasp in order to eat this worm that's called the corn borer. And as the name implies, it completely decimates the corn crop. And so they do try to do some of this. That was relatively successful, but we know in other situations that it didn't really turn out that great. So they introduced Indian mongoose, which is kind of this larger rat weasel type of creature to control the Asian rats in Hawaii and on other islands. But what they know is, okay, yeah, they ate the rats, but they also eat sea turtles, they eat other type of amphibians and also birds. So introducing organisms that have a wide range of feeding patterns can lead to unintended consequences. So that was a situation that didn't go very well.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, right? Talked about that. They also may use insecticides in order to control certain pests, and while that can definitely be a strategy, I've got an example of how that didn't work out very well. But those are some different strategies that can be used to help agriculture. We also have issues with overharvesting. So this is the reason why there are very specific hunting and fishing laws, and why there are hunting and fishing seasons and very specific numbers that you can take of certain species. The previous PowerPoint showed population curves. And so people who are making these laws and rules take a look at those population curves to make sure that the populations are healthy. So there is a reason for that. And then just a reminder that we have the three main causes of global biodiversity. And for that essay question, I would just make sure that you can explain what each of these three causes means, and then some examples are always good. I need to grab a Kleenex real quick. All right. Questions so far?
No, it's good.
Okay. So majority of the water that is on the planet is not fresh water. Majority of the water on the planet is actually salt water, and that water is not used for for drinking water, and it's not used for water that we get out of our faucets. So when local fresh waterways get polluted, it really impacts the direct local area. So this is in Orange County, Florida, and you can just see all of that pollution coming out of there. With all of the construction that's going on in North Carolina, a lot of the kind of smaller creeks that I see look like they just have a lot of dirt that's kind of turn up in it. And so I don't necessarily think it's pollution per se, but it's not clear at all. And I would expect a lot of those kind of streams that we see out in the forest to be clear. So I think while it's not necessarily pollution, I would anticipate it's definitely impacting the low areas. We can also see on these rocks quite clearly, while it looks like the rocks have a suntan, what it actually is that the water line used to be up there at the top, and it no longer is. So we can, see where a lot of this water recession has occurred.
Wow. Okay.
So this gives us an idea of what I was mentioning about fresh water really not being that much. So we've got 97.5% of all of the water on the planet is salt water. And if we think about how much of that fresh water is actually usable, it's really not that much, because a lot of it is tied up in ice and in glaciers. The groundwater can be used because that usually goes into aquifers, which are kind of like pockets of water under the ground. And then out of that surface water, about half of it is in lakes. So you can see as we go through, local pollution in these fresh waterways really is a problem and impacts us more than we think. They also have to add more stuff to our drinking water, the more polluted our local water sources are. So chlorine is one example of something that they may add to the water, and fluoride as well. Do you know if fluoride is added to the water in North Carolina, Brittany?
Could you please repeat that?
Fluoride. Do you know if that's added to the water?
I think so. I think I've read that on the back of the label before.
Sometimes that's added as well.
I know it's a lot of different stuff, like minerals and stuff they have to enhance the water.
Yep, absolutely. So not only does that fresh water include lakes and ponds, but rivers and streams, and then also the wetlands, which marsh is another word for that. And you do see a lot of wetlands and marshy areas here in North Carolina. And those marshes actually act as filters. So while they may seem like they're just kind of mucky, they filter the water and they provide a lot of habitat for animals. With that salt water, North Carolina does have saltwater biomes out by the coast is what we're talking about. So that could be coral reefs. You've got animals that live really just kind of in the open sea. And then you do have organisms that can live in the deep sea. So meaning they don't require a lot of light, they can withstand high pressures. Really relevant to North Carolina is where we have the freshwater meeting the ocean. So this would be the estuaries, and they call it brackish water. And that just means it's a mix of salt water and fresh water in the intertidal zones. So those are areas where the tides go out and come back in. Both are heavily used as breeding grounds for animals and super, super important for biodiversity. The last section here talks a little bit about global warming and how the atmosphere of the Earth really acts as a blanket to trap everything in. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's what causes the Earth to be habitable and be a temperature that supports living organisms. The problem can be when that atmosphere gets too thick and we just have so much trapping of those greenhouse gases, which include carbon dioxide and methane. So think about the atmosphere as like a blanket for the Earth, and then it traps all of that in.
Repeat that. Sorry.
Yeah, so the atmosphere, it's like a blanket for the Earth. It traps all the heat in. So if we are making more gas, more carbon dioxide through factories, it makes that layer thicker, and then it traps more of those greenhouse gases, and so it makes the Earth warmer.
Okay.
You see some of the heat escapes, but as we create more heat, more is reflected back down.
Okay.
And some data to take a look at. So we're tracking carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And in terms of the age of the Earth, we're in the 2000s over here. We can see that there has just been a straight up increase in the amount of these greenhouse gases directly related to industry and humans putting these gases back into the environment. In terms of how much our certain activities contribute to that, so electricity is about 40%. So this is through fossil fuel combustion. So this is all about taking carbon out of the earth through coal or by making gasoline. That also relates to our transportation uses. I don't know about you, Brittany, but I've been using so much less gas now that we've had the pandemic and everyone is working from home.
It takes like $10 to fill my car up now.
Yeah. And I think I've even seen some pictures of certain big cities that because everyone is staying at home, the smog is less, and the air pollution is definitely visibly decreased. So that's interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then this last data set here tracks the average global temperature over a 10-year average. And so we're looking at that average just going straight up here. The blue line is the annual average. And so if you think about seasons, we get the spike because it's warmer in the summer throughout the world, and then it's cooler in the winter. And so the red line actually, I guess, accounts for that swing, and it shows us that we're on an upward trend. And whenever we're looking at graphs, we want to make sure that we take a look at what the scale is. So this is a big increase, but I do want to point out that we're talking about a change of what, like 56.8 degrees Fahrenheit to 58.1 or so. So even though that's a small number, that's a pretty big jump for an average. And something just to think about, while an overwhelming majority of scientists agree that this greenhouse gas accumulation combined with global warming has been caused by humans, it is still very much a controversial topic. Do you have any thoughts as to why that's still so controversial?
Sorry, let me write some notes.
No problem.
Well, I mean, the facts here, tell us that, the it's true. Like the greenhouse gases, they actually trap in the heat. So I mean, people can disagree about it, but I mean, you just gotta look.
Yeah. Sometimes I also think that people are like, okay, well, I see that data, but it's not really affecting me right now. So why would we put all of this money and change towards doing something?
But it's gonna get worse and worse in the future, though, if we don't,
Yeah,
take action now.
yep, absolutely, for sure.
And some people don't think about they just think about the moment, but if it as it builds up, like over the years, grandchildren and people that's going to live, years to come, and if we keep this, a persistent problem, it's just going to get worse.
Yep, absolutely, for sure. On the Blackboard site, underneath this part of Unit 5, I added a link where you can actually calculate what your specific ecological footprint is. And so this is the estimated amount of land and water that it is required for one person to do what they do on a daily basis. And I think these footprints give us a nice visual of what that looks like in the United States. So on average for the entire world, we're looking at 2.7, and this is just kind of a standardized value. It doesn't have units really or anything. In order for us to live a sustainable lifestyle long term, that world average needs to be 1.8. Oops, sorry. And if we look at the US ecological footprint, on average per person, that value is 7.2. So the US just uses so many more resources compared to other places of the world. And we can even see this color coded throughout the entire world. And we can see the US and Australia, some places in Europe, really are in the unsustainable range. Brittany, what are some ways that you think that we can reasonably reduce our footprint?
By recycling and using stuff that that we commonly throw away, and like just taking precaution, because some people just like wasting stuff for no reason, such as like wasting water and just wasting plastic and stuff like that can be reused.
Mm-hmm.
And that way it'll save other people can use those resources rather than just wasting it.
Oh,
And that's for
absolutely.
food too, and like a lot of stuff we use in America, like a lot of stuff get thrown away, and it's like it can be reused, like.
Oh yeah, definitely. I agree. To me, it all falls under the category of convenience. It's really convenient to get something wrapped in plastic and eat it real quick, and then we've just used a bunch of plastic as opposed to making something at home.
Right.
And right now, because of COVID-19, I think we're forced to do a better job reducing our ecological footprint. And I know for us, it has shown that while we used to eat out a ton, we hardly do now. And I think in our heads, it was just so much work to cook at home and took so much time. But I think a lot of that was just in our heads, and it really doesn't take a lot of time. It just requires some planning to do.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
I think we just live in a lazy country, honestly. Like a lot of get done fast, and
yeah, it's that convenience piece for sure. This section kind of wraps back into what we were talking about at the very beginning, that in order to sustain biodiversity and making sure we're not harming species, there are actually areas of study that look at these specific problems and create solutions for these problems. So conservation biology looks at the different patterns and then tries to present solutions to restore and make sure that the different organisms, plants and animals, are able to survive and thrive. one specific example that we have seen has been super positive is that the bald eagles used to be on the threatened and endangered list, and they are no longer. They have a breeding ground from Alaska all the way down to Florida, and I think I have seen some in North Carolina in the recent months. But what had happened is there was a insecticide that had this chemical called DDT in it, and the eagles would get exposed to it, and then the shells of their eggs would become really thin, and then they would break prematurely, and their young would not make it. And so since they have removed DDT from use, we have seen drastic recovery. So this is a great example of how that conservation ecology identified the problem and then actually caused a solution that positively impacted the species.
Where did the DDT come from?
Chemical used in insecticide sprays. So humans sprayed it on plants to try to reduce insects.
Okay.
We also have certain biodiversity hotspots that are designated throughout the entire world. And this just means that there are a lot of endangered species in that region, and there are a lot of endemic species. And what that means is that that species is found nowhere else on the entire Earth except for that one specific place. The ring-tailed lemur is a great example of this. It's only found in Madagascar, which we see as the island off the coast of Africa. In the United States, Florida is an area of biodiversity, specifically because of their reptile population. And then also the manatees that live in the ocean there. California has some biodiversity hotspots as well. So those particular areas are going to be protected. As I was mentioning earlier, the habitat connections are super important. So if we are developing certain areas and fragmenting habitats, some areas have been very aware of this to try to make natural connections. So this one is actually in the Netherlands, where they have created greenery that goes over the highway. I've actually seen something similar to this down in Naples, Florida. The Florida panther is something, or is an animal that really needs a lot of land to roam and wants to cross the road in order to get to bigger breeding grounds and habitats. And they've actually done this down in Naples. They put up these big nets so that the animals don't cross the highway, but they're more likely to then go across the green area. And there's maps that actually show this. So they do this in the US.
Cool.
They also do something called bioremediation, and this is to make sure that the soil is healthy in order to plant different crops. So they may put down different components to try to detoxify the soil. This last section here talks about sustainable development, so policies and procedures in order to do what we were talking about earlier to make sure that our habits are sustainable and that we're making things better, not worse. And that's really one of the roles of education, because a lot of people may not realize the impact that they're having. And part of that education process is having that realization and also realizing that even though we are individuals, we can really have a big impact. All right.